I'm pleased to introduce to you today Professor Craig Murphy. He's a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science here at Wellesley College. Professor Murphy's book, International Organization and the Industrial Challenge, Global Governance since 1850, is one of the most contemporary attempts to provide a unified account on the rise of the global policy system, while the rest of his research has focused mainly on the current system. He continues to work on UN reform. He co-directs the University of Massachusetts Center on Governance and Sustainability. His major current project is to lay out an agenda of options for reforming the UN environmental system at the Environmental Summit this summer. One of the components of the agenda is proposing a design for a global financing mechanism. Professor Murphy is also part of the team working on the future of the UN development system. The group includes the former leaders of the number of UN agencies and is supported by the development ministries of the UK, Germany, and Norway. The aim is to reshape the current system of some 93 separate agencies into something that is a little more efficient and result-focused. He also participates in the Global Poverty Summit that is recommending a new set of global anti-poverty goals to replace the MDGs after they expire in 2015. In addition to his work at Wellesley, Professor Murphy has also served as a visiting faculty member at Brown, Johns Hopkins, and Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Professor Murphy has received a BA from Grinnell College, his MA and PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he also studied at the Commonwealth Institute in London and University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. Please join me to welcome Professor Murphy.
Thank you. What I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about the broader global policy system and some of the reasons why the kind of work you've heard about just in that first point is actually some of the most important policy-making work anywhere in the world, globally, whatever, right now. So this is the kind of, in one sense, this is just a big sort of cheer for the kind of work that Eileen and her colleagues are doing. But I want to put it into a larger historical context and a larger context of global problems. This chap over here, Kishore Mahbubani, is someone I got to know a number of years ago when he was the ambassador from Singapore to the United Nations. And for a long time, he was like the dean of the ambassadors, the guy who'd been there the longest period of time. Now he's running something called the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And about a year ago, he wrote this really interesting article called The Problem with Presidents. And the problem with presidents, he says, is that presidents are really good leaders. The world has lots of them. But the real problem is the most important problems we have right now are not problems at a national level. The most important problems we have right now are at a global level. So that's the issue that I want to talk about, which is, okay, we've got this problem of lots of policy issues that are at a global level, but we don't have the kind of leadership that is associated with it. And notice that Lee Kuan Yew is a very good writer. People from Singapore don't usually talk about what a great guy Mao Zedong was, so that, this kind of makes it an interesting writing aspect. So what I want to do is talk about things that are called global problems, and then global governance, which is the thing that might have to deal with that. Talk a bit about two types of leadership, intellectual leadership and political leadership. And intellectual leadership isn't the problem. It's something called political leadership. And then finally, get into a little bit of a discussion about where to turn. So first, global problems. Global problems. Susan Strange, who passed away at the end of the 20th century and was probably the greatest scholar of international relations, English-speaking scholar of international relations in the second half of the 20th century. Susan Strange said that, in 1998-99, she wrote about what she thought were the most fundamental global problems. And she associated them all with what she called the Westphalia system. That not Westphalia, but Westphalia. Because she said, the Westphalia system, the system of sovereignty of nation states that we currently have, developed along with the development of modern capitalism. And they reinforce each other. And that leaves three types of problems that are truly global that are not handled by this connection between the market capitalist system and the nation-state system. She says, first, you have some problems that are truly global because they're physically global, something that people in economics departments never tell you about. You know, environmental problems are, some of them, not all of them, are physically global. Climate change, species loss, things of that sort. So these are things that, you know, are really problematic because they truly cross national boundaries, and they're physical sorts of things that economists never talk about. The second sort of thing she says is that the growth of the international financial system, along with the nation state, left us with a situation where the financial system doesn't really have anybody who looks over it as a whole. And it periodically results in huge crises, crises that sometimes result in worldwide depressions. Now, Susan was writing this right before she died, right after the Asian financial crisis. And when she wrote this, yes, there were a few people in Asia like Mahbubani who said, oh yeah, Susan Strange has got it exactly right. But of course, all of the really smart people in Western countries, in Western Europe, the United States, et cetera, we all said, Susan is completely wrong. We know how to run the international financial system. We don't have problems like that anymore. We'll have nothing like that, the Great Depression, ever again. She was sort of right. Finally, she talks about how this kind of connection between nation states and the international market results in problems of inequality that cannot be solved because they are truly transnational or global. Because the inequalities that exist at a global level and even within particular societies are ones that are connected to the international economic system. So she says, these are three kinds of problems. Most problems are not global. Susan hated international organizations. I like international organizations. Susan hated international organizations. She hated the UN. She hated the World Bank. She hated the IMF. She hated all of that stuff. She loved the nation state. She actually wanted the world to be run at the most local level possible. But she says we've got some problems that are actually truly global. I want to add a few more things. Oh, I always forget about him. I never put him down in the corner. Do you know this guy with the red hat? Notice he wears those colors, those jewel-like colors, but you ought to think about why guys don't have to wear jewel-like colors all the time. Anyway, never mind. This guy just wrote a big report, jewel-like color, he's really cool. This guy, the Pope, just wrote a big report saying, we have these three sets of problems that are truly global and can only be handled blah, 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 blah. He quotes Susan Strange a number of times, which I'm sure Susan would be rolling over in her grave thinking about that. But in any case, three types of global problems. I want to add a set of, it looks like five, but it's really two other types of problems. The first one is global pandemics, things like polio. And they are global problems for the same reason that climate change is a global problem. They are global problems because our entire species gets attacked by certain types of predators. And if we can't deal with them globally, everywhere, then we can't deal with them. So pandemics, that's a kind of global problem. These are all interconnected. This is the problem of that in certain parts of the world, you have really, really awful people who are dictators and warlords who run their society by killing people, right? That's a big problem. And the existence of those sorts of people is associated with a very wonderful global arms trading system. There's a system where it's really easy to get, if you have certain amounts of money, et cetera, it's really easy to get arms almost everywhere. And it's kind of hard to understand why we have this global arms system, but there's a connection to a bigger kind of military system that exists that Dwight Eisenhower, this guy, used to say was a very big problem. That is to say, something happened in the 20th century that some societies, including perhaps the United States, perhaps China, perhaps Pakistan, have become a lot of others as well, have become over-militarized because of a connection between the government and security issues and a military industry. The military industry, I mean, Pakistan's military industry, one of my good friends, Professor Canland, who was also a student of Jagdish Bhagwati's and used to, I've heard Bhagwati once praised Christopher. Christopher was giving a talk on the Council of Foreign Relations, and Bhagwati was the guy who introduced him, and he praised him for exactly the same reasons. He said, "This is one of my few students who understands that the market needs to be used all the time to make the world morally better, et cetera, and that if consumers knew about things like green this and global that, labor that, then things would be good." But to go back to the arms industry of Pakistan, the arms industry of Pakistan lives up to all of the ISO green standards. It's one of the great industries in that sense. But it kind of contributes to this thing, too. And all of these things are connected back to the international financial system, where you've got this kind of problem of organized crime, which is also linked to terrorism and getting all kinds of activities, and you can't actually figure out where the money comes that goes to different activities. If you could cut the money, if you could cut the guns, you could probably cut the dictators and you could probably cut the terrorism, but you might not be able to do that without changing something about the political economy of the military. So, these are global problems. When you have problems, you're supposed to have government, right? We never call it global government because that's a bad thing. It used to be a good thing, now it's considered a bad thing, so we say it's global governance. My definition of global governance is what world government we have. That's really global governance. So what world government we have, our environmental issues are dealt with by a series of protocols, treaties, some of which work really well, the Ozone Protocol for Montreal, some of which don't work very well, like Kyoto for the other things. The financial system is supposed to be regulated by the IMF and by various private and semi-private public banking standards, which I don't know whether Professor Joyce told you a bit about how those work or don't work, but if you take his international finance course, you would know a lot about that. Inequality, well, at a global level, we have things like the Millennium Development Goals, which I've worked a little bit with, and the UN Development System, these 93 separate organizations, which I work a little bit with. And the story that you heard about someone who's lived an entire life as a development organizer from a country like Canada, who might say at the end of his life, yes, there was one project that worked. That's not as strange as you might imagine. And then for some of these other things, we do have the WHO, which was helping India and a number of other places with different things. We have the Global Fund for AIDS. For warlords and dictators, we have the Security Council. We have the Responsibility to Protect, which I know some of you are working on. Responsibility to Protect. Oh, there, R2P people. We have the International Criminal Court. There's a proposed arms trade treaty that they're actually going to be allowed to negotiate. The U.S. has blocked negotiation of the proposed arms trade treaty for a very, very long time. Lots of Africans want it. The Obama administration, for some crazy reason, decided that it was okay to actually negotiate this, but the U.S. and China agreed that there could be only 48 hours of support by the UN Secretariat for the negotiation of this treaty over the next 2 years, so it's got a little bit of a problem. The issue of over-militarization, I don't know what we have. Actually, organized crime is dealt with, and terrorism are dealt with quite well by Interpol compared to some of these other things. But we don't have very good systems. So, why don't we have these systems? Well, people who work on the study of global governance say that we don't have these things for 5 different kinds of reasons. We don't have them sometimes because we don't understand how the system works. That's finance, for example. In some cases, we don't have them because we don't have agreements upon norms. The issue of the arms trade is primarily one where there are different forces in many different countries, some of whom think having arms, all the arms possible, is groovy and a human right, and others who would actually like to, control the arms trade. In some cases, we don't have coherent policies. It's not that we just don't even know how the system works, but we might know how the system works, but we don't know how to design a policy that would actually do anything. And then finally, we have misspelling. We have organizational or institutional problems. That really should be one up above. And we have compliance problems. So those are kind of different sets of problems. Now, back to my friend Mahbubani. These kinds of things involve intellectual leadership, Mahbubani would say, and these kind of things involve what he would call political leadership. The political will and the ability to bring coalitions together to create new organizations and to create new compliance mechanisms. The intellectual leadership issue really isn't such a big deal. It's not such a big deal because in the last 10 or 15 years, you've started to have groups of people who are intellectual leaders actually thinking about global problems. This is Mahbubani again. He quit working for his government and started to work for a public policy school, and he created a master's and doctoral program in global governance. And he hired this guy who was out of a job, Professor Kofi Annan, to start educating this group of doctoral students who are working on these global problems. And Mahbubani was not the only guy who did this. The National University of Singapore, and there are over 20 other programs focused in the same way that have developed around the world. Interestingly enough, of those 20 programs, you would think the US being the intellectual center of the world, which it is in lots of ways, there's only one such program in the United States. There are two in Toronto, right? I mean, just as a kind of little difference. They're mostly in Japan, in some of the places like Singapore and Hong Kong, in Western Europe. They're mostly in South Africa, in Brazil. They're mostly not in the United States, just a minor sort of thing to think about. So the intellectual leadership is there, but we have this problem of looking for political leadership. And if you guys, those of you who've been forced to read UN things as you've been working on your project, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of discussion saying that all you need for political leadership is something called political will. I mentioned my friend Professor Candland. Professor Candland and I have always wondered who this political will guy is. And we decided, maybe he's a janitor at MIT, and so that, we were going to do a movie called Political Will Hunting. But anyway, it was taken by this other guy. So in order to talk about political will, that's the rest of the time, I want to put the current problem in a larger historical context. I want to think about who should have the power and the will, and the power certainly should be great powers. I mean, they would have the ability to establish organizations and to do work on compliance. And so I want to say something about when great powers help, and then something about when they don't. So that's the rest. Okay, now, here's the problem. This is the point where all of you guys who think you're out here just solving the world's problems without having to listen to academic lectures, that's what isn't that what the Albright Institute is all about? You come to the Albright Institute and you solve all the world's problems in a few days, right? And you get away from those terrible academic lectures and history and blah, 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 blah. Turns out you're going to have a bunch of history and blah, 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 blah right here, okay? To understand this, so here's to understand why we have this problem of political will, you have to understand that the current problem is one that is embedded in the history of the economy, and especially the history of the economy since the Industrial Revolution. Remember Susan Strange, global problems are associated with the West failure system, sovereignty, plus the capitalist industrial economy, right? And in order to understand this, it's important to understand that there's sort of 5 stages in the development, or 5 periods in the development of the capitalist global industrial economy. These 5 stages are associated with different industries. Cotton textiles is where the Industrial Revolution was all about. Have you ever been up to Lowell? Anybody? No. Lowell. I mean, the mills in Lowell were the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and especially in England, not only New England. The second sort of wave of industry was in the middle of the 19th century. I like to exaggerate, so I make all of these things look really simple by saying that's 1800, this is going to be 1850. Second wave of industry was associated with railroads and steel, and you started to get kinds of places, larger places that were becoming industrialized. The US as a whole, Germany as a whole. By 1900, you started to get another wave of industries. Remember Thomas Edison, you've heard of him? Or the Eiffel Tower? The industries at the end of the 19th century were associated with electricity. That's what the Eiffel Tower was all about. It was actually showing you this great electrical thing. And things like chemicals, right? So Bayer aspirin, invented at the end of the 19th century, made lots of people healthy and wealthy, not wise. Then when in my, oh, I forgot to say, during that electrical and chemical era, there were economic spaces that existed almost globally. There's what many economic historians call the inter-imperial system, the economy that linked the European empires, which of course all expanded during that period of time, right? And you get the first international organizations during that period. So you get things like the International Telegraph Union, or start operating at that period of time, the Universal Postal Union, the earliest ILO. Then we've got the period of the automobile and jet age. That's kind of when I was a kid. That was the period of great prosperity immediately after the Second World War. And it was the period when another set of international institutions were created, the UN and a set of organizations that connected the industrialized countries, the trilateral organizations connected, like the OECD, connecting the US, Japan, and Western Europe. And then finally, we have this current era of the information age and the age of global manufacturing, when we have this kind of global liberal order, right? So that's where we are. Political scientists, all kinds of social scientists, and those of you who had me in class know this, that the first thing that social scientists ask is, what is this an instance of? Right? So the question is, we're wondering why we don't have political leadership now, right? And so what is the current problem an instance of? Well, I say it's an instance of the building of a new type of economic system at a larger level than before, and the building or non-building of political institutions associated with them. So political historians say that period of the Industrial Revolution is when you get the consolidation of the modern nation state. And you get strong states in certain parts of the United States. The railroad and steel era is an era when you get continental-sized states becoming integrated out of nothing. Germany was 500 separate states at the beginning. For Germany to become the place that could get the railroad and steel industry, Germany became integrated. The United States, anyone from the South? Anyone from the South knows that the United States Constitution was a constitution of an international organization. It wasn't a constitution of a nation state. It was a constitution of an international organization that had this one little silly clause in it that says, called the Commerce Clause, if people traded from one place to another, that stuff could be regulated by the federal government. It took something called the Civil War for the US to become an integrated nation state. Again, integration. The inter-imperial system and the first global intergovernmental organizations were associated with larger markets, associated with Edison Electric, which is everywhere, the Singer sewing machine, everywhere, the chemical industries like Bayer, everywhere, the automobile and jet age, the UN and the trilateral system, and now we're in this kind of global age of global manufacturing. The age that actually is probably the most similar, the transition that's most similar to our current one is the one around 1900. The beginning of the electrical and chemical industry era. And it was a period of time when, this is a book that was written in 1899, the United States of Europe on the eve of the Parliament of Peace. In 1899, there was a big meeting that was going to take place in The Hague, did take place, and the idea of that meeting was to create a general international organization that would not only solve all kinds of problems of commerce, but it would regulate international commerce to make sure that in the inter-imperial system, labor standards were raised to the highest possible level. So you couldn't have any of that awful stuff like the Heart of Darkness taking place anymore, right? It was going to do that. It was going to make sure that conservation was going to take place. We now call that ecological issues, because industry was destroying the what we now call the environment, but they called it nature back in those days. So there were going to be conservation organizations, and there were going to be organizations associated with the rights of man, which we now call human rights. Okay? That was 1899, and this was a great book. In the first time international relations was taught at Wellesley, this was one of the textbooks that was used. Okay, so we're at the 5th time that we've been in one of these industrial eras. And hey, here's one of the things that's really interesting. International cooperation, global governance, was needed to create the current global economy. Okay? So we said there were all these other global problems. There's no need to have a global economy. There really is no need to have a global economy. You may have some ideologues in economics who tell you that there's a need, that human beings have always wanted to have a global economy, that we've always wanted to have Gucci purses made in China. No, there's no need for a global economy. We're actually physical beings. We need food, we need shelter, we may need some clothing, we need water, and we can get all of that locally. So there's no need for a global economy. There's no need for a continental economy like that of the United States. There's no need for a national economy like that of England. We can do really well with economies that are real small. So creating a global economy is not a global problem. Remember, global problems are those that are only done at a global level. But we created global governance to create a global economy. And we found that that was easy to do. We created a global market through a whole series of activities. Some of them created the communication systems that are used to get information across the global market. The most important thing that was probably done, and my friend Paul Krugman has finally realized this after 20 years of lots of other people telling him this, that the biggest change was actually the creation of container standards, which lowered the port costs of shipping by 96%. 1970s, ISO, we've already been told about ISO, that's that standard setting organization, created state container standards which lowered port costs by 96%, because you didn't have to take every little shirt off one ship and put it into another ship, right? And finally, we ended up with, at the end part, we ended up with some rules of trade and of international agreements. And it turns out that a lot of these things, there was a lot of global leadership. The creation of the internet, the creation of Intelsat, the creation of the communication system was led by those guys. That's the US, in case of the symbol there. And there was a lot of international leadership with the rules of trade, the WTO, and TRIPS. That's the basic thing that Bill Clinton did. That's Bill Clinton's big thing, is he got us all of this, the rules that would allow us to do this, so that all of us in this room are wearing clothes that were produced in horrible, probably un-SA 8,000 regulated factories around the world. Oh no, not there. But okay, so that's what we've got. However, if there are things that would be called market-making international institutions, we haven't been very good at creating market-taming international institutions. And this is where that 11-page article that all of you read for today comes in. Right. There have been at least 4 or 5 different times when there have been attempts to create market-taming institutions, institutions that would regulate the bad things, financial crises, environmental things, things associated with inequality, like horrible labor conditions, et cetera, that come out of this global market. There was a long time from 1970 to 1992 when it was done by diplomats trying to create legally binding regimes. Then there started to be a period of time overlapping when individual companies, like our friends at Levi's, sometimes supported by people in the United Nations staff, tried to figure out ways to do it. They had some problems. Then you kind of get a second round of creating voluntary standards, not just by progressive companies and by nice people in the United Nations, but you get non-governmental organizations with some intelligence, that come in and start finding ways to actually make some of these things work. That's what you've just heard about. And then there was an attempt at the end of the beginning of this century by Secretary General Kofi Annan to do a comprehensive reform of the United Nations system. I was working in the UN at that time and was kind of part of that, so I always like to mention that part. Someone who was associated with all of these things is this bald guy here. His name is John Ruggie. Remember Ruggie Rules? You heard that as something that, and he was involved with all of these things. He's an academic, actually. He's a college professor at Columbia for most of his career. And he was involved in trying to figure out how to do legally binding labor, environmental, and human rights standards for a long, long time. And he started to work with the UN staff on these kind of voluntary standards pretty early on. He was very much involved with the creation of the Global Compact. He and his good friend Kofi Annan, both of them claim responsibility for it, which is interesting. It's nice when more than one person does. I actually think Kofi did it, but what can I say? I went to the same school he did in Ghana, so I believe him more. He's definitely been deeply involved with the non-governmental organizations, and even after the failure of Kofi Annan's reforms, Ruggie has worked for the next Secretary General. They weren't going to get a Secretary General like Kofi Annan again. He was a mistake, like Dag Hammarskjöld was a mistake. So the next Secretary General was the guy who was chosen by John Bolton, who was the American ambassador, who made sure that all of that didn't happen, and by the Chinese. And so we got this guy who's turned out not to be half as bad as we thought he was going to be, but who, the current Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. And Ban Ki-moon has appointed Ruggie to continue to be a special representative, and he's been working on creating a set of norms, primarily focused on the ideas of human rights, that could be applied to companies in a voluntary way, although John will say he actually doesn't want it to really be that way if he could think of another way of doing it, that has become a new, again, standard-setting system, although a standard-setting system in a way done by a single person, even a great expert. And there's some problems with setting standards by a single person. So, creating these social norms, creating market-taming institutions, was a big problem and has been a big problem ever since we started to move into this era of global manufacturing. Remember the dates? We start to get those container standards in the 1970s. That's when you start getting global manufacturing. Even before you have the rules for trade associated with it, investors are putting their investment in because it's cheap enough to do it. You have transformations in China, et cetera. It's impossible, though, to get any agreements on these social norms at an intergovernmental level. Yet, the last time around, it was easy to do this. Well, this professor right here, this bald guy who was a lot younger in 1982, is the guy who explained that. He was the great professor who explained why it was easy. It was easy, Ruggie said, that something that he called embedded liberalism, which is really jargon. And I'm sorry for the jargon. You always create jargon in a field. Many of you are economists, so you know that you take things that are completely straightforward and you surround them with jargon so that nobody knows what you're talking about. Well, political scientists like Ruggie and me do that too. So he describes market taming. He talks about market taming when he's like drinking with me and my wife, right? But when he's being academic, he doesn't talk about market taming. He talks about embedding free trade in social welfare norms like the welfare state and decolonization. So that he calls embedded liberalism. Liberalism, a free trade world embedded in larger social norms. Like, okay? So the same thing, market taming means the same thing. He says that happened because of American power. That it was the US that basically helped create a series of international institutions, some of which were organizations, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, which were actually concerned with taming the market, not extending the market originally, like the entire UN development system. The US power did it. There was leadership. Leadership in 45, there isn't leadership today. Well, many years later, John Ruggie John Ruggie's ideas were taken up by John Eikenberry, a guy who in 2001 looked like this and will soon look like that. Right. Anyway, John Eikenberry, in a book called After Victory, came up with the general argument about why this happens. He says that after big, horrible, nasty, disgusting wars, the victorious powers, after big, horrible, nasty, disgusting wars, the victorious powers often create market-taming institutions to socialize, to bring in to the same set of norms, former and potential adversaries, to bring them into the same normative world. Okay? So, John Eikenberry's dissertation advisor, and therefore the person that he's the most influenced by, is someone named Theda Skocpol. Any of you know Theda Skocpol? Theda Skocpol is maybe now the kind of most important political scientist who works on American politics at Harvard University. Her new book that you should go buy immediately is on the Tea Party. But one of her big books was about what happened after the Civil War in the United States, when the victorious powers, let's call them New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, the victorious powers imposed a set of rules, some of which were things that were supposedly the things that they were fighting about, which turned out to be labor standards, slavery, imposed a set of rules upon the entire country, but some of those rules were the beginning of the welfare state in the United States. What a strange thing to do. The US central government that was created by these victorious powers, that is to say, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, imposed a new system that would be one where the federal government would be getting bigger and bigger and bigger, would regulate commerce and do sorts of other things, but would also start to provide pensions for widows and orphans. A really weird thing to do, because if you think about the United States at the end of the war, who was going to benefit from that? The same people who benefit the most from the welfare system today. It's not people in those highly industrialized states like New York in those days, Pennsylvania, highly industrialized, Massachusetts. The people who benefited the most were people in the South. New set of norms, victorious powers create market-taming institutions to socialize former and potential adversaries. You bring in the South based on these higher levels of norms which are important for your country and make your country do really well, but are good for everyone. Again, that's Eikenberry writing in 2001. There's a much more fun book that just came out by an English historian, Dan Pletch. Great cover. Notice the jewel tones in it again. Great cover that, it's like 2 months old. America, Hitler, and the United Nations, how the Allies won World War II and forged the peace using the United Nations system in all of its complicated ways to reinforce the welfare state and decolonization. Okay. So, now here's the problem, though. Normally, great powers do not pursue these long-term interests that are the interests of their former enemies as well as of themselves. Normally, great powers just pursue narrow, short-term interests. You all know that from Political Science 221, international relations. That's what governments are supposed to do. For example, remember I told you 1900 was the time that's the most similar to today, right? Remember that big conference that took place in 1899, first of 3 conferences that were associated with trying to tame the markets that had been created at the end of the 19th century. One of the things that was going to be done to tame those markets was to stop the epidemics that were being reinforced by the new level of trade that existed around the world. It turned out that because there were now many more ships going from one place of the world to another, bringing stuff like the rubber that was being taken from slaves in Congo to Belgium, They were also bringing new diseases, terrible, nasty, awful things. And the way you could stop those new diseases was simple. It was something called quarantine. When somebody started crawling with smallpox as they were coming into port, you would quarantine the entire ship and let the disease dissipate throughout the ship, and then, make sure that the ports didn't get it. Well, at that conference in 1899, there was one government, a single government, that opposed it, and therefore there was no agreement. That government was Great Britain, because Great Britain controlled 75% of world shipping. And quarantine would impose things on shipping. And the British said they did this. They did this because there was no scientific proof of the germ theory of disease. There was this idea, the germ theory of disease, that had been around for about 50 years, and it said that disease spread by these little tiny germ-like things, right? And in fact, every British scientist pretty much believed in the germ theory of disease. Alfred Nobel created the Nobel Prize in Medicine, and almost all the early Nobel Prizes in medicine were won by British medical scientists, all working on the germ theory of disease. But the political parties in Britain said, whether on the left or on the right, they said, it is unproven. The germ theory of disease is totally unproven. In fact, we all know the problem is miasmas, that there's bad air in certain places. Why do you call it malaria? Huh? Bad air, the miasma theory of disease, the creationist theory. Oh, sorry. Anyway, the miasma theory of disease is the reason that we can't have agreement on this stuff. British scientists got crazy about this, but didn't help. Short-term interests being pursued of a single set of companies. Whew, I'm supposed to have stopped. I'm going to have to say a few more things, though. Second time, 1907, they were going to try this again in 1907 and 1908. The British decided that they couldn't really have any discussion about this stuff in 1907 for the same reason that the Obama administration says we can't discuss any of this stuff anymore. There was a financial crisis in 1907, kind of like the financial crisis of 2008, and everything had to stop. So the British vetoed everything again in the second Hague Peace Conference in 1907. For the third Hague Peace Conference, which was going to be in 1915, Andrew Carnegie, who knew that this was going to be the moment when the world was going to finally be regulated, when an intergovernmental ILO was going to be created, International Labor Organization, when a whole bunch of he built the Peace Palace in The Hague, which is where the International Court of Justice meets. Beautiful building, one of the most fantastic places you can go, but they never had the 1915 conference because World War I broke out, and just to go back to the story at the beginning of this one, the global influenza epidemic of 1918 was the end of kind of World War I, which turned out not to have been caused by miasmas. Okay, so that should lead us to this. We should understand that the US, this is normal times. This isn't the end of a war. The US is unlikely to lead in the creation of international institutions. In fact, the US is going to be likely to be like Britain, and has been. It doesn't matter whether the president is Obama, who I, of course, support deeply, or Hillary Clinton, who would have been better because I'm from Wellesley, or whether the president is George Bush I, who was a great international relations president, probably the best in my lifetime, except for Eisenhower. These are controversial views. It doesn't matter who the president is. The US isn't going to do it. It's going to use its excessive power to make sure that its narrow interests are served. Okay, so what can we do? Well, maybe we turn to intergovernmental organizations. I mean, to non-governmental organizations. That should be an N. Again, a spelling mistake. That's an NGOs. Maybe we should be turning to non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, because if you think about container standards, the way the internet is governed, things like SA 8000, these are things being done by highly intelligent intergovernmental agencies. Second place we could look is we could look to the experience since 1850, where the major supporters of international cooperation at all levels tend to be what are sometimes called middle powers, which doesn't mean powers that are sort of middling in size. It means powers that are in the middle, powers that whose lives deeply depend on the liberal order. Trading states, places like the Netherlands. We heard that they were kind of supporting this kind of stuff a little bit. Places like much of Scandinavia, small societies that can only survive if they're actually constantly in trade. Places like even Canada. So maybe we can rely on those guys for leadership. And the other thing is that some people argue that maybe we can rely on rising powers. That the problem for the Britain of 1900 or the United States of 2000 is not only that it's a great power, but it's a great power in decline. It's a great power that within your lifetimes, sorry guys, I know for the Americans in the room this is sometimes a bad thing, I'd never be elected into Republican president or anything of that sort. But the bets are that the US is going to be kind of a normal power like a few others by the time you're my age. You know, it's not going to be real extra special. It's going to be sort of, it's not actually real extra special right now. Oh, never mind. And remember that the times when states did things really well and led, great powers led, they were rising powers. So maybe the rising powers, the current rising powers, the BRICS or something of that sort will do this. And this especially may be the case because it might be that we're living in a period of time where interstate war, like the Civil War, you're from the South, so it's an interstate war, right? Okay, like the Civil War, like the Franco-Prussian War, like World War I and World War II, those sorts of things may be obsolete. We don't know. So maybe the rising powers will just do this because maybe the issue is they know that they're going to become kind of the world's rulers and they'll want to socialize and bring others into a different kind of order. But all of these are things that at the end of any academic talk, you all know that you have to say FRIN, which is further research is necessary, right? FRIN. So these are all things we don't know, and I could tell you about the research projects that are going on these things, but that would take too much time. And I just want to say that we're back to taking college courses and that sort of stuff, FRIN. Colleges and universities can provide the leadership in trying to understand why whether any of those alternative leaders might be able to do the kind of things that they're doing. Currently, one of the projects I'm working on is research with my wife, Joanne Yates, who's the deputy dean at the Sloan School of Management, and she and I have just recently written the first academic book, scholarly book ever written on the ISO, which is surprising that nobody had bothered to do it, which is this network of international standard-setting organizations. And we're trying to understand the impact of a variety of activities like those we heard about this morning, and the likelihood that they could lead to this sort of transformation. So you guys here, part of what you should be thinking about doing is not just solving the world's problems right now, but also doing some of the research that's necessary to do a few other things. Oh, let me just leave with the puzzle or the big problem. So here's the big problem. This is like going back to my friend Eikenberry or going back to Dan Pledge. Embedding a new order, creating the market taming institutions. We have all of these, what is the current situation like? It's like 4 previous situations. 2 times there was success. An international order was created in Germany with German unification and with the creation of a set of norms that actually controlled the market. There was a great power that did it. The great power was Prussia. Prussia imposed the Prussian welfare state and Prussian ideas about labor control and conservation on all of Germany. Good deal. No big problem. Second time that happened was the automobile age Western system. The US basically put its norms upon all of the West, not everywhere else. The 2 times that didn't happen, the railway age United States, slavery was a big problem. There was no predominant power. It would be great if New York had been a predominant power, but Virginia was there too. We ended up with a little problem. The second time was a late 19th century inter-imperial system, colonial slavery, labor and safety consequences of the new stage of industrialization. Britain was unwilling to do anything. There was a predominant power, but you had no political will. And you ended up with World War I. This is a really good question to be trying to figure out how to solve. A question that's more important for you than it is for, say, Eileen and me. We're going to be dead, one way or another, about the time that these bad consequences would happen. So we've got to find the political power, the political leadership someplace else, because it's not going to happen here. Okay, great. Questions?
Thank you so much, Professor Murphy, for speaking with us. My question is relating to the new emerging world order. So to what extent do you think the new emerging world order can be able to prevent some of the failures, or in what regard that they can learn from the lessons of the past?
Yeah. First off, you can go. There's a great article in the journal Globalizations about a year ago. I think it was the March or June issue. That it's written by this guy named Murphy from, anyway. In Globalizations, it's an issue on the global financial crisis and the consequences, and it's sort of learning from the past to think about what this new order would be. I don't know. I do think I think a lot of this is a research question, and we know how to ask the research question, but we don't know what the answer is. We know that one of the puzzles of the research question is whether we're moving to a transition in power, that's the new order that's taking place, a transition in power that could take place without war. And there's a lot of good reason to think that we might be living in that, but we're not thoroughly convinced. Another book to read, Joshua Goldstein's Winning the War on War, will talk about that and try to figure out why he's got that right or why he's got that wrong. There was a nice debate in the New York Times Sunday magazine letters last week about whether he's got it right or wrong, which isn't a bad place to start. And then the second thing is to think about the political will, that horrible word, of the different rising powers. The BRICS, which I sometimes like with a big S and a double I, so it's, the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, second I put there is Indonesia, China, and S, South Africa. The other countries want South Africa to be part of the group. I think the political will of some of the countries works in one direction and the others doesn't. I think there's a big difference between Brazil and India, of the big BRICS, and China and Russia. And I think that conflict between governments who, for whatever reasons, and they really have a lot to do with the way the governments came to power, the way Brazil transitioned to becoming this sort of successful poverty-reducing state it is, the way, even with all the problems of the ANC, the way the ANC came into power in South Africa to be reducing apartheid, and then the long history of India as a democratic, supposedly anti-poverty, well, and seriously, I think they are, anti-poverty oriented state. In theory, they're not very good in practice. That gives you a different set of issues of willingness than you have with the other powers. The US, as I said, is like Britain. And I think the US can be swayed, and it is a great power, as is Europe. Europe has the same kind of political, if they don't fall apart completely because of financial crisis, has the same kind of political will as Brazil and India. The US can be swayed probably one way or another. It can act like Britain at the end of the 19th century, or you can imagine it being sort of a follower, but we can never call ourselves a follower. A leader who just doesn't happen to lead, but along the other way. So I think there are opportunities in a variety of different directions, but I think to understand whether those opportunities are there requires an understanding of the question Goldstein is raising: are we living in a world where war really isn't going to happen in a period of transition? And the second question is the will of the rising powers, and The third question is whether the will of those powers can change from one period to another because of things like financial shocks and that sort of thing. So I can tell you how to answer the question. I can't tell you what the answer is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Melanie.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Murphy. You just mentioned that we might be seeing the end of interstate war. What do you think about intrastate war? Certainly, our group's been looking at R2P, the responsibility of...
Oh, no, I mean, see, this is why I think that, the sort of Susan Strange focus of saying that there are things that are really global problems. So the reason that I think thinking about things that are truly problems at the global level, the problem that you guys are facing, which is war inside societies, that's the stuff that comes because of our warlords and dictators, right? And is reinforced by the global trade that takes place and is reinforced by the global inequalities that exist. I think that if we don't think about the idea of global problems, we might have a tendency, as many of my political science colleagues do, to look at these intrastate wars and say the way to look at them is just as like, any other kind of war or like any other type of civil war that's ever existed. I think that, yes, we're going to still have that as a huge problem, and I think we're going to have it because of the relationship that Strange talks about, the Westphalia relationship between the sovereignty of the international system, which might lead us to not have interstate war. I think Goldstein might be right about that, actually. And its interconnection with an unregulated free market. So yes, we're going to have more and more of those. And we're going to have to use R2P and everything else that we can figure out to deal with them.
Oh, yes, I'm Karen.
Karen.
I was just wondering, do you think that global governance or a shift towards global governance is inevitable, given that the United States doesn't seem to want to take any leadership position or cooperate within, because you said that the United Kingdom was able to successfully block the...
Yeah, yes, I do. Although the reason that I do is going to sound terrible. The reason I do is that I actually don't think interstate war is obsolete. I think that the arguments made by people like Goldstein and Steven Pinker, Goldstein really does say that it's obsolete, but Pinker says it might be. I think that they're probably wrong, and I actually do think that we're kind of at a period. The problem of your lifetime is basically a problem of finding the political leadership to deal with the emergent problems of this global manufacturing economy world, or else face war. And I'm fairly sure that after that war, just because of the scale of these economies have been getting larger and larger, that after that war, the degree to which we have things left, that system will be regulated at a global level, and that the global level problems that were understood as the problems that we are living with right now will in 2035, 2040, after that war, if we can't figure out how to deal with them before then, they will be regulated. The winners in that war, whoever they are, will do the same thing that they've been doing since 1815, which is imposing a set of institutions that will, some of which will actually have to operate truly at a global level, that will socialize and change the world in the interests of whoever happens to win the war, China.
So what you just mentioned, I'm very curious about. Do you think it's going to take a war to change the international system?
No. Remember, I think we're going to. The international system, I think, is going to change. That was the answer to the last question. But my hunch is that we might be able to find the necessary leadership elsewhere, either among those non-governmental organizations. Remember, that's an N, like Social Accountability International, working together, or in combination with the middle powers, the states for whom the international trading system really matters, and maybe in combination with the rising powers, who I want the rising powers to believe Goldstein's work. I want them to. I really want lots of people in China and everywhere to believe that, it would be crazy. We don't live in that kind of world where war is a solution to anybody's problems anymore. We really don't live in that world, because that would reinforce the kind of possibility that you would have political leadership coming from a variety of places, from civil society, from those powers in the middle, as well as from some of the rising powers. So, I'm an optimist, so that's really what I think is going to happen. But if it doesn't happen, we're still going to get a system of global governance. We're just going to get one that will be global governance with Chinese characteristics or Indian characteristics. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marise. I would like to know your opinion on how do you think non-governmental global institutions, such as, for example, the World Bank, could reduce this inequality that inequalities that you're talking about, and
So
also pandemics.
The World Bank is an intergovernmental organization. It's a membership organization of governments, and it is part of the United Nations system. People in the World Bank usually don't like to talk about that, or at least for a long time they didn't like to talk about it. Mr. Wolfenson, who you'll run into, actually does occasionally, more than occasionally, admit that it's part of the United Nations system. The World Bank's purpose is to reduce inequality. I mean, at least its purpose is to create development and to reduce poverty. And in fact, these days, most people in the bank recognize that reducing inequality is part of it as well. So that's one thing. That's why it was created. The second thing is that the bank itself is a learning organization. It's one of those organizations that I've seen skeptical signs in the back. It doesn't have an ISO management system, but it has something that's kind of the equivalent of an external ISO management system, so that they learn from their mistakes. They learn from their mistakes through their very close connection to the academic field of economics. It'd be much better if they learned from their mistakes by having an internal system. I have lots of friends who work in evaluation in the World Bank. And they would really love the bank to be an organization that works like intelligent companies, where if they figure out, there's a monitoring system going on so they can figure out whether they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing and what they pledged to do. That's the kind of thing that was point number 9, is it, of the... it would be nice if the bank had that system. It has part of that system. It actually has an evaluation office, but there isn't a connection back from the evaluation office into policy making in a coherent way. But we know from political scientists who look at this that the bank actually does learn over time, and it's probably a little better, or at least, it is getting better at reducing. Yeah, I'm going to say that. It's getting better at doing things that may reduce inequalities now than it was, say, 20 years ago. So I just say they have to keep on what they're doing, but the main thing that I would try to do is try to connect back the system of their own monitoring, their own evaluation, back into policy making.
Yeah, the second part of the question, I don't think I phrased it right. What about NGOs?
What about NGOs?
Yeah. What role would they play in reducing inequality?
There are lots of different NGOs, right? I mean, there's some that are focused, deliberately, deeply focused on those kinds of activities. Everything from the global set of charities that are Christian and Muslim that do a lot of work in different parts of the world, to things like Amnesty and health-related organizations like you'll be hearing this afternoon. Many of them, I think we don't have good research on this, but there's a hunch that many of them do things that are dedicated to reducing inequalities, actually do things that probably do reduce inequalities. I mean, that's probably true. But you should understand that there are lots of other global non-governmental organizations that are aimed at other things for which inequality is actually a good thing. And one of the most powerful organizations represented within the United Nations system is the coalition of arms rights organizations associated with the U.S. National Rifle Association. And next to ITOS in Brazil, which is one of my favorite outfits because it involves people from the business community as well as from interconnected to it are labor union groups and green groups of one sort or another. next, probably an influence to that organization within Brazil over the last 15 years is the Brazilian group that's concerned with gun rights. So, and they operate globally, and they're trying to make really sure that everybody in the world has the right to have as many guns as they possibly can. That's a global non-governmental organization. Al-Qaeda is a global non-governmental organization. You know, I sometimes wonder, sorry, that's the kind of thing I'm not supposed to say. I don't sound dignified if I were to say, like some of my friends might say, that the harm that's been done to the world by that first set of global non-governmental organizations I talked to versus that by Al-Qaeda might be on the same proportion, but I won't. But I know many people, I know people in African in organizations in Ghana and Nigeria that are anti-gun organizations that work across Africa who would say that very clearly. In fact, the head of of ECOWAS, Victor Bejo, has said that quite clearly. So.
My name's Bethel, and we've been talking a lot about global governance and leaders and problems, and not a lot about the roles of global citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And apart from what we're doing at the ALBRIGHT Institute, or like the researchers in Kofi Annan's university in Singapore, what else can we do? What advice would you have for the global citizens of today?
Well, there are two places where they come in. You got one in my talk, and you got one of them, and I always am glad if I give a talk like this that somebody is going to ask that question. There are two places clearly where they come in. Place number one is, in fact, you know, for folks like you, it's really easy. I mean, you're students. You're learning. You're actually can be solving a lot of those issues and learning about trying to figure out, doing the research necessary to answer the ones where we don't know what the answers are. The second thing is you can work in global non-governmental organizations and you can support their work. One of the things, going back to Goldstein, one of the things he always says all the time, he's even more obnoxious perhaps than I am, is that you should be acting, thinking responsibly. If in fact you think it's a really good idea for companies around the global commodity chains to not be screwing their workers and destroying the environment and reinforcing the production of arms everywhere in the world, you can be a responsible consumer. You can actually think about this stuff and buy stuff. You can, as a member of an organization like Wellesley College, which buys lots of stuff and invests Google's amount of money, and you are a part of those organizations, you could say, hey, I understand that you have some really important alums from this school who, for the last 40 years, have been giving you the capacity to actually use that power. Why don't you do that? So, yes, place one is as a student. Place two is as a citizen who is in a position to act responsibly to support the kinds of activities that may have some influence. You know, place number three, obviously, is to use your political system in any way that you can. It would be better, you know, depending on what the political system you're involved in. You know, make sure that the George Herbert Walker Bushes become the candidates of the Republican Party rather than the John Boltons. Just as a simple. But that, and I choose those not because, well, I do choose them because I like one rather than the other, but I use them as examples because they are the extreme examples of the difference in American foreign policy making. Bolton, who was the American ambassador during the time that Kofi Annan was trying to unify and reform the United Nations system, is ideologically, philosophically, let's not use ideologically, philosophically opposed to the development of any kind of regulatory system beyond the level of the nation state, and sees international institutions only as instruments of American foreign policy, short-term foreign policy, right? And he writes and talks about that all the time. He and John Eikenberry have debated constantly about this. George Herbert Walker Bush, you know, people accused him of not having the vision thing, but George Herbert Walker Bush was a guy who did actually have a vision. He believed that we should be creating a global liberal order, and that the opportunities that existed at the end of the Cold War for consolidating that kind of order, which required strengthening the United Nations, were things that needed to be done. He was willing to let the US power be used to, it turned out to be a disaster, but the will is very important, to let US power be used in Somalia just to support the idea that people shouldn't be starving to death. That was a, Bolton, you know, US power now a short-term interest, blah, 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 blah. No international institutions, bad things. George Herbert Walker Bush, global liberal order maintained by institutions at every level, including the United Nations system, that are necessary, and the US has responsibilities toward different parts of the world. Those are two ends of a particular political party. If I were, you know, voting, I can't vote for him anymore, but I'd vote for Huntsman if I were in South Carolina right now, because he's the George Herbert Walker Bush side of that, to the extent to which he's anything. Yeah, please.
Murphy, given the increasing globalization of political and economic systems, especially with the rising powers, how is the status of state sovereignty diminished or enhanced?
Okay, the words, I'm going to tell you how sovereignty changes, but the word that you're, okay, so the question is, given the world the way it's changing with the rise of these powers, with the new international institutions, et cetera, how is sovereignty either diminished or enhanced? And I'm going to change the question, because by asking diminished or enhanced, you're asking a question that doesn't have an answer. There's never been a time when sovereignty is diminished or enhanced. Sovereignty has been changed. There's a wonderful article written in 1994 in the leading journal in international relations called International Organization, written by a guy named J. Samuel Barkan. Anybody run across him? So J. Samuel Barkan has this brilliant article about the history of sovereignty. And the key thing is that sovereignty changes. This thing called sovereignty, Westphalian sovereignty, the kind of sovereignty that Susan Strange was challenging, which is this idea that the only final legal justice exists at the level of the nation state, that is a kind of momentary definition of sovereignty. It was a definition of sovereignty that even, certainly throughout all of my lifetime, throughout all of the 20th century, sovereignty has never just meant, except perhaps to John Bolton, that the state is the final legal moral order. Sovereignty in that sense was a solution to a European problem in 1648. Sovereignty was the solution to the problem that Europeans were killing each other over religion. And the solution was to say whoever was the prince could decide what the religion was. That's what, that was the definition of sovereignty at that point. And therefore, the highest moral order was the prince. Prior to that, sovereignty was a contingent power associated with the prince that was a type of power that was below the power of other greater powers, which included the church as a whole. And Barkan, I know this stuff a little, even more than probably Sammy does, but it used to be in Europe, different in other parts of the world, powers at other levels were associated with gods at other levels. So that there's a choir of angels who are called powers or princes. There's another choir of angels that are called seraphim and cherubim. And they're associated with higher levels of power, higher levels of authority. What happened in 1648 is suddenly the princes, the angels, associated, the guardian angels of princes, became the highest level of authority we could have on earth. Since then, that kind of authority has been changed over time. At the global summit that took place at the beginning of this decade, pretty much everybody in the world agreed to a change in the nature of sovereignty. What sovereignty means, the leaders of all parts of the world agreed to the idea of the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect says sovereignty these authorities, these princes who claim sovereignty, lose sovereignty when they can no longer protect their own citizens from various forces, especially themselves. Woo, that's a change in sovereignty. And what Barkin argues is that what sovereignty has meant has changed over time. And what the creation of the kind of global governance Susan Strange would mean is that sovereignty would have changed to mean that any government, any sovereign, that can not only not provide for the lives of their citizens, but also cannot provide for the security, human security of their citizens, their ability to feed themselves, have economic dignity, et cetera, that those groups have also lost the right that they have to claim sovereignty, and then it becomes the responsibility of the rest of the international community to back up and do other things. So sovereignty is changing, yeah, and it's going to change. Yes, Ellie.
You say that there's no need to have a global economy, and yet we live in a world where there is an ingrained transnational economy. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the methods you see to deconstruct or transition away from this?
Oh, I like the global economy. I'm just saying there's no need for it. So I haven't thought about that, but I know there's some people who have. E.F. Schumacher, the Buddhist economist, do you know him? So Schumacher was a student of John Maynard Keynes, very close friend of Gandhi, wrote a number of very important books about creating economies at the lowest possible level and that had the least impact on the rest of the living world during his life, and particularly in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He spent the end of his life actually working in the World Bank. Spent the beginning of right after World War II in the World Bank as well, because he was very concerned about development. He gained through Gandhi a sort of sense that ideas of development based on growth were probably not terribly sensible. Started to learn a bunch of Buddhist ideas, and then took his Keynesian economics back to the idea of how to create the most local, feasible economy that can fulfill the most human needs, and what transitions would be. So Schumacher would be the person I'd send you to.